In the autumn of 1944, German factories produced 2,199 tanks, not 219, not 22, 2,199 tanks, more than in any comparable period of the war, the product of Albert Speer's rationalized war economy running at peak output despite the bombing campaign that had been trying to destroy it for 2 years. The factories were working. The Panzer IV assembly lines at Nibelungenwerk were running 3 shifts. The Panther production at MAN's Nuremberg facility was hitting numbers that the Allied intelligence estimates had said were not achievable. The German war economy, bombed, battered, and repeatedly declared on the verge of collapse by the airmen attacking it, was producing armor at the highest rate of the entire conflict. Less than half of those tanks ever reached German forces. The factories were working. The assembly lines were running. The tanks existed. They sat on rail flat cars at loading depots east of the Rhine, waiting for the trains that would carry them to the front. The trains did not come. The bridges were down. The marshaling yards were rubble. The repair crews that fixed one section of track found the next section destroyed before they finished. The locomotives that should have been pulling the flat cars west were sitting in sheds waiting for fuel that had not arrived because the fuel trains had been interdicted at a junction 300 kilometers away. The tanks sat until the Allied armies overran the depots where they were waiting. This is the sentence that explains the air war over Europe in 1944. The Allies did not win by destroying what Germany made. They won by preventing what Germany made from getting to where Germany needed it. The decision that produced this outcome was made on March 25, 1944, in a conference room in London, by a general who was about to be told by every senior airman in the Allied command that he was wrong. The general was Dwight Eisenhower. The decision was to stop bombing German factories and start bombing French railways. The airmen who told him he was wrong were Arthur Harris, Bomber Harris, head of RAF Bomber Command, the man who had been burning German cities since 1942, and Karl Spaatz, commander of the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, the man whose 8th Air Force had been dying over Germany since 1943, trying to bomb it into submission. Both of them had been doing the wrong thing. Not because they were incompetent. They were among the most capable air commanders of the war. Not because their targets were unimportant. German factories and German cities mattered. But because the thing they were trying to achieve, preventing Germany from fighting, could not be achieved by destroying what Germany produced. It could only be achieved by preventing what Germany produced from reaching the men who needed it. The distinction sounds simple. It took 3 years of bombing and thousands of aircrew deaths to force the Allied command to act on it. Harris had been bombing Germany since 1942. His instrument was RAF Bomber Command, a force of Lancaster and Halifax heavy bombers that flew at night, dropped incendiary and high-explosive loads on German industrial cities, and had by early 1944 burned Hamburg, Cologne, and a dozen other cities to varying degrees of ruin. The theory behind the campaign was explicit: destroy German industrial capacity, destroy German civilian morale, force Germany to divert resources from the front to air defense and reconstruction, and eventually produce a collapse that made a ground invasion unnecessary, or at least easier. 2 years of bombing had not produced a collapse. Speer had reorganized German war production in 1942 and achieved production increases that defied the damage being inflicted from the air. Dispersal, underground facilities, rapid repair, the German industrial economy had demonstrated a resilience that the pre-war bombing theorists had not anticipated. Harris knew this. His response was to bomb harder, to increase the weight of attacks, to burn more cities, to push the campaign to a scale that would eventually exceed Germany's capacity to recover. Spaatz was pursuing a different theory. His 8th Air Force had been conducting precision daylight bombing since 1942, targeting specific industrial facilities, ball bearing plants, aircraft factories, synthetic oil refineries, with the idea that destroying specific bottlenecks in the German war economy would produce cascading failures. The theory was sounder than Harris's area bombing. Its execution had been catastrophically expensive. The Schweinfurt raids of 1943 had demonstrated that unescorted daylight bombers over Germany died at rates that no air force could sustain indefinitely. Both theories shared one assumption. The way to stop a German tank was to prevent it from being built. Eisenhower was about to replace that assumption with a different one. The man who gave Eisenhower the idea was a zoologist. Professor Solly Zuckerman had spent the 1930s studying primate behavior at Oxford. The war had brought him into the orbit of the British Air Ministry as a scientific advisor, a man whose job was to apply systematic analysis to questions that military professionals were too close to their own assumptions to examine clearly. In 1943, Zuckerman had analyzed the results of Allied bombing in Sicily and southern Italy and reached a conclusion that contradicted everything the bomber generals believed about their own effectiveness. The most effective bombing targets, he found, were not factories. They were railways. Specifically, marshaling yards, the complex of tracks, switches, and service facilities where trains were assembled, repaired, and dispatched. A marshaling yard was not glamorous. It did not have the symbolic weight of a ball-bearing plant or an aircraft factory. It did not produce anything. But it was the point through which everything that was produced had to pass before it reached the front. And it was uniquely vulnerable to bombing in ways that factories were not. A factory that was bombed could be repaired, dispersed, or replaced. Speer had demonstrated this repeatedly. The German industrial system had an inherent flexibility. Damaged capacity could be shifted, supplemented, worked around. But a marshaling yard that was bombed could not be easily replaced, because there was only one railroad network, and it ran through fixed points that geography and engineering had determined decades earlier. Destroy the yard at a key junction, and every train that needed to pass through that junction was stopped. Not just the trains carrying the specific commodity you were trying to interdict, but everything. Zuckerman brought this analysis to Air Marshal Arthur Tedder, Eisenhower's deputy, in early 1944. Tedder read it and understood immediately what it meant for the planned invasion of France. The German response to a Normandy landing would depend on moving armored reserves from their current positions to the beachhead quickly enough to destroy the Allied lodgment before it could be consolidated. The reserves existed. The Wehrmacht had panzer divisions in France, Belgium, and Germany that were fully capable of reaching Normandy and pushing the invasion back into the sea. What they needed to do it was time. Time to move along the roads and railways of occupied France without being destroyed from the air. The transportation plan was designed to eliminate that time. Not by bombing the tanks, not by bombing the factories that made them, by bombing every bridge, every marshaling yard, every repair facility on the rail network between Germany and Normandy, so that when the reserves tried to move, they would find a network that had been systematically destroyed at its most vulnerable points, and the movement that should have taken days would take weeks. Eisenhower endorsed the plan in February 1944. Then the arguments began. Harris did not want to divert his bombers from the German city campaign. He had been burning cities for 2 years, and he believed, with the specific conviction of a man who had committed an institution to a course of action, that the campaign was working and needed only more weight to produce its promised results. Diverting his Lancasters to marshaling yards in France was, in his assessment, a waste of the strategic bombing force on tactical targets. Spaatz had a different objection. He believed the oil plan, bombing Germany's synthetic fuel refineries, was the correct strategic target, and he was not entirely wrong. Destroying Germany's fuel supply would eventually prove decisive. His objection to the transportation plan was that it was the wrong priority at the wrong moment. Both men also shared a concern that neither stated publicly with full candor. The transportation plan required bombing targets in occupied France. France was a country the Allies were supposed to be liberating. The marshaling yards at Trappes, at Juvisy, at Laon. They were surrounded by French towns, French workers, French civilians who had been living under German occupation for 4 years and who were about to be bombed by the air forces of their liberators. The casualty estimates were not small. Planners projected up to 160,000 French civilian casualties from the transportation plan. Churchill brought this to Roosevelt personally. He asked the president to intervene and alter the plan. Roosevelt refused. Albert Speer understood something that the Allied bomber generals did not. He had understood it since 1942, when he took over as Reich Minister of Armaments and began the systematic reorganization of German war production that would, over the following 2 years, increase output of tanks, aircraft, and artillery, even as Allied bombers destroyed the factories producing them. The understanding was this: a factory is not a fixed point, it is a process. And a process can be moved, dispersed, duplicated, and rebuilt faster than it can be destroyed from the air. The ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt were the clearest example. The 8th Air Force had identified Schweinfurt in 1943 as a strategic bottleneck, a facility that produced a significant fraction of Germany's ball bearings, without which aircraft engines, tank transmissions, and artillery mechanisms could not function. The theory was correct. Ball bearings were a genuine bottleneck. The October 1943 raid on Schweinfurt cost 60 B-17s and 600 men in a single mission, the worst losses the 8th Air Force had suffered. The damage to the Schweinfurt facilities was real and significant. Within 6 weeks, German ball bearing production had recovered to pre-raid levels. Speer had done 3 things simultaneously. He had dispersed production to facilities across Germany that the Americans had not targeted. He had imported ball bearings from Sweden through supply channels that the bombing campaign could not interdict. He had pushed his engineering teams to redesign components to require fewer ball bearings per unit. The bottleneck that was supposed to strangle the German war economy had been routed around before the smoke from the October raid had cleared. This pattern repeated itself across every category of target the Allied bombers attacked. Aircraft factories dispersed, tank production shifted to facilities that had previously been building locomotives. Synthetic oil plants were repaired faster than the bombing campaign's planners had projected. The German industrial economy was not a rigid system that would collapse when its critical nodes were destroyed. It was an adaptive system that responded to destruction by rerouting, dispersing, and improvising. Speer's memoirs, written after the war, describe his reaction to each major bombing campaign with the professional detachment of a man assessing a problem he had already solved. The Schweinfurt raids, overcome by dispersal and imports. The aircraft factory campaign of early 1944, overcome by underground facilities and dispersed production. The synthetic oil campaign that began in May 1944, the one that genuinely frightened him because fuel could not be improvised and the refineries could not be easily dispersed. The oil campaign was Spaatz's contribution, and Speer later acknowledged it was the correct strategic priority, the one targeting decision that the Allies made which he could not fully counter. But Speer's memoirs contain a different assessment of the transportation plan, and it is more revealing than his comments on the oil campaign. He writes that the systematic destruction of the French and Belgian railway network in the spring and summer of 1944 produced consequences that he had no tools to address. Not because the railway system could not be repaired. German railway repair crews were among the most skilled and motivated workers in the Reich, and they repaired tracks faster than the bombing campaign expected. But because the railway system was a network, and a network that was being attacked simultaneously at hundreds of points, could not be repaired fast enough to keep up with the destruction. A factory had a location. A railway network had thousands of locations. Every bridge, every marshaling yard, every repair facility, every junction was a potential target. The repair crews that fixed the yard at Trappé found the yard at Juvisy destroyed while they were working. The crews that moved to Juvisy found Trappé destroyed again. The network was not being damaged at specific points that could be repaired and restored. It was being degraded across its entire length simultaneously, at a rate that exceeded the repair capacity available. Speer could disperse a factory. He could not disperse a railway network. This was Zuckerman's insight, expressed in the specific language of an engineer who had spent 1943 measuring bomb damage in Sicily and understanding what bombing could and could not do. Bombing could not destroy industrial capacity faster than industrial capacity could be rebuilt. Bombing could degrade a network faster than a network could be repaired. if the bombing was sufficiently widespread and sufficiently sustained. The transportation plan was both. The German railway system in 1944 was the circulatory system of the Wehrmacht. Everything moved by rail. Tanks from factories in Bavaria to depots in France. Fuel from synthetic refineries in Silesia to forward storage points in Belgium. Ammunition from production facilities in the Ruhr to divisional supply dumps behind the front. Food, replacement personnel, medical supplies, spare parts. The entire logistical apparatus that kept a modern army in the field depended on the railway network that connected Germany's industrial heartland to the armies fighting on its periphery. The network was vast. It was also fixed. Unlike a road network, which could route traffic around damaged sections, use secondary roads, improvise detours, the railway network ran on tracks that had been laid in specific locations for specific engineering reasons. A bridge over the Seine, at a specific point, existed because the Seine was there, and the valley was there, and the gradient required a bridge at that location. There was no alternative. A train that could not cross the Seine at that point could not cross the Seine. It stopped. The transportation plan's targeting logic was built on this specificity. Zuckerman's analysis identified the most vulnerable points in the French and Belgian railway network, the bridges over major rivers, the marshaling yards through which traffic had to pass, the repair facilities without which damaged locomotives could not be returned to service. These were not dispersible targets. They could not be moved. They could be repaired, but repair required time, materials, and labor that the bombing campaign was also attacking. A bridge that was repaired was a bridge that could be bombed again. The Allies began implementing the transportation plan in earnest in April 1944, 6 weeks before D-Day. The results were visible within days in German railway traffic reports. Train movements in northern France dropped sharply as bridges went down and marshalling yards were cratered. German railway repair battalions, specialized units whose entire purpose was restoring damaged infrastructure, were overwhelmed. They fixed one bridge and 2 more were destroyed. They cleared one marshalling yard and the next yard in the sequence was hit. The repair crews were working at maximum capacity and falling further behind. By the end of April, German traffic reports showed that through train service from Germany to the Normandy coast had been essentially eliminated. Supplies that had previously traveled by train from the Rhine to the Channel in hours were now moving by truck over roads that were also being attacked, taking days, arriving in quantities that were a fraction of what the rail system had been delivering. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding Army Group B in France, was receiving these reports. He understood their implication with the professional clarity of a man who had spent 4 years watching logistics determine outcomes. A panzer division that could not receive fuel could not move. A division that could not move was not a reserve, it was a fixed fortification. The mobile defense that Rommel was planning for the Allied invasion, concentrating armor rapidly at the point of landing and destroying the beachhead before it could consolidate, required a railway network that could deliver fuel and ammunition to his formations faster than they consumed it in combat. The transportation plan was destroying that railway network 6 weeks before the invasion began. Rommel wrote to OKW in May 1944 about the supply situation in terms that the official histories have preserved. He described the Allied air campaign against communications as the most serious threat to the success of the defense. He was not referring to the Luftwaffe's inability to protect his formations from tactical air attack. That was a separate problem. He was referring specifically to the destruction of the logistical infrastructure that his panzer reserves needed to operate. He was right, and the problem he was describing had begun not with a bombing raid on a German city, but with a zoologist's analysis of railway marshalling yards in Sicily. The tanks that Germany was producing at record rates in the autumn of 1944, the 2,199 that sat on rail flat cars waiting for trains that did not come, were the delayed consequence of the decision Eisenhower had forced through on March 25th over the objections of Harris, Spaatz, and Churchill. The decision had been correct. The tanks proved it by not arriving. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich was stationed near Toulouse in southern France on June 6, 1944. It was one of the most powerful formations in the German order of battle, a full-strength armored division with experienced crews, modern equipment, and a combat record stretching from the Eastern Front to Normandy. Its orders, when the Allied landings began, were straightforward. Move north to the beachhead as rapidly as possible and join the counterattack that would destroy the Allied lodgment before it could be consolidated. The division began its march on June 8th, 2 days after D-Day. Under normal conditions, the conditions that had existed in France before the transportation plan, Das Reich could have covered the 450 miles from Toulouse to Normandy by rail in approximately 3 days. Load the tanks onto flat cars at Toulouse, move north through the French rail network, detrain near the front, and arrive ready to fight within 72 hours of the order. The transportation plan had eliminated normal conditions. The bridges over the Loire were down. The marshaling yards at Limoges and Périgueux had been cratered. The repair facilities that should have been maintaining the locomotives were damaged or overwhelmed. The rail network that should have carried Das Reich north in 3 days could not carry it at all. The division moved by road. Moving an armored division by road instead of rail is not simply slower, it is categorically different in every operational dimension. A tank moving under its own power consumes fuel at rates that rail transport does not. A column of vehicles moving on roads is visible from the air in ways that a train moving at night is not. A road march of 450 miles wears out tracks, stresses engines, and arrives with vehicles that need maintenance before they can fight effectively. And a road column moving through occupied France in June 1944, with Allied tactical aircraft hunting anything that moved on daylight roads, was not merely slow, it was dangerous. Das Reich took 17 days to reach Normandy, 17 days instead of 3. The division that should have arrived at the beachhead while the Allied lodgment was still fragile and the German counterattack still had a chance of success, arrived 2.5 weeks late, with vehicles that had been attacked from the air repeatedly en route, with fuel consumption that had depleted its forward stocks, and into a situation that had changed fundamentally from what it would have faced on June 9th. The Allied beachhead that Das Reich reached on June 25th was not the beachhead of June 9th. By June 25th, the Allies had landed over 800,000 men and 150,000 vehicles. The beachhead was consolidated, supplied, and defended in depth. The moment when a single, fresh Panzer division, arriving at full strength, might have tipped the balance, had passed 2 weeks earlier. Das Reich's experience was not exceptional. It was the standard German experience of June 1944. The 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte, moving from Belgium, took 9 days instead of 2. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, closer to Normandy, arrived faster but with its fuel and ammunition stocks depleted by the road march. The Panzer Lehr Division, the most lavishly equipped armored formation in the Wehrmacht, assembled from the instructors of Germany's tank training schools, moved from its assembly area near Chartres and arrived at the front on June 9th, only to discover that the road march and air attacks en route had already cost it dozens of vehicles before it fired a shot in anger. Every German armored division that tried to reach Normandy in June 1944 arrived later than planned, in worse condition than planned, with fewer vehicles than it had started with. The transportation plan had not stopped them, it had delayed them. And in the specific arithmetic of the Normandy campaign, where the Allies needed days to consolidate and the Germans needed to counterattack before consolidation was complete, delay was decisive. The German railway repair system was one of the most capable organizations of its kind in the world. The Reichsbahn, the German National Railway, had been managing large-scale infrastructure repair since the Eastern Front campaign began in 1941, where combat and Soviet sabotage had repeatedly destroyed sections of track that German forces needed to supply their advance. The repair battalions that had been developed for the Eastern Front were skilled, well-equipped, and experienced at restoring damaged infrastructure under difficult conditions. When the transportation plan began in April 1944, these battalions were redirected to France and Belgium to counter the Allied bombing campaign. They worked around the clock. They were not sufficient. The specific problem was simultaneity. A repair battalion that could restore a bombed marshaling yard in 48 hours was an effective organization when it faced one bombed yard at a time. The transportation plan was bombing dozens of yards simultaneously, while also hitting bridges, tunnels, locomotive repair shops, and fuel depots. The repair crews finished one job and moved to the next, only to find that the job they had just completed had been bombed again while they were working on the next one. German traffic management records from May and June 1944 document this in specific terms. Train movements through the key junctions in northern France dropped from hundreds per day to dozens. Junctions that had been processing 40 trains per day were processing 4. Locomotives that had been running continuous service were sitting in depots, waiting for repairs that the maintenance facilities, themselves bombed, could not complete. The cumulative effect was visible in what reached the German front. A Panzer division in combat consumed approximately 300 tons of supplies per day: fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts. The railway network that had been delivering those supplies in June 1943 was delivering a fraction of that quantity in June 1944. German division commanders were filing reports through the summer that described the same problem in different language, but with consistent content. Insufficient fuel to conduct mobile operations, insufficient ammunition for sustained artillery fire, insufficient spare parts to keep vehicles running. The 21st Panzer Division, which was the only armored formation actually positioned near Normandy on June 6th, and which launched the only serious German armored counterattack on D-Day itself, ran out of fuel during its attack and had to halt. Not from Allied fire, from empty fuel tanks. The division had fuel for 1 day of operations. The resupply that should have arrived by rail had not arrived. The attack that might, in the specific chaos of D-Day, when the Allied beachhead was at its most vulnerable, have driven to the coast and cut the landing force in two, stopped because a tank without fuel is not a weapon. General Friedrich Dollmann, commanding the 7th Army in Normandy, sent a message to OKW on June 12th, 6 days after the landing, that the official histories have preserved. He described the supply situation as critical. He described the road network as under continuous air attack. He described the railway network as effectively non-functional for military purposes south of the Seine. He asked for relief supplies by air. OKW could not provide them. The Luftwaffe, that had controlled European airspace in 1940, no longer controlled the airspace over Normandy in 1944. The air corridor that would have been required to supply a besieged army by transport aircraft did not exist. Dollmann died on June 28th, officially of a heart attack, though some accounts suggest he took his own life after receiving orders to court-martial himself for the loss of Cherbourg. He had commanded an army that was fighting at a fraction of its supply requirement, on a network that the enemy had systematically destroyed before the first shot was fired. He had understood the problem clearly. He had no solution for it. By September 1944, the transportation plan had accomplished something that its architects had not anticipated. It had worked too well. The Allied armies that broke out of Normandy in late July and drove across France in August moved so fast that their own supply system could not keep up. The Red Ball Express, the 6,000-truck convoy that operated around the clock on dedicated routes from Cherbourg toward the advancing front, was covering the gap, but it was not sufficient. Patton's Third Army outran its fuel supply in late August and stopped near the German border, not because of German resistance, but because the tanks had nothing to put in their tanks. The irony was precise. The transportation plan had destroyed the French railway network so effectively that the Allies, who now controlled France, could not use it to supply their own advance. The repair effort that began in September 1944 was the mirror image of the destruction campaign. American and British railway engineers moved into France behind the advancing armies and began restoring the network that Allied bombers had spent 4 months destroying. The work was substantial. An estimated 1,500 bridges had been damaged or destroyed. Hundreds of marshaling yards required repair. The locomotive fleet had been reduced by bombing and German withdrawal to a fraction of its pre-war size. The repairs took months. In the interval, the Allied advance slowed, not only from German resistance, which was stiffening as the Wehrmacht fell back toward the German border, but from the logistical constraint that the destroyed railway network imposed on every operation that required moving supplies more than a truck convoy could carry. This was the unintended consequence that military historians have debated since 1945. Whether the transportation plan's destruction of French railway infrastructure contributed to the Allied logistical crisis of autumn 1944, and whether that crisis, by slowing the Allied advance and giving Germany time to rebuild its defenses, prolonged the war. The debate is genuine. The evidence supports both sides. What is not debated is what happened to the German side of the railway equation in the same period. The Allied advance into France had overrun the repair infrastructure that the Germans had been using to maintain the battered network. The German railway battalions that had been working in northern France were gone, killed, captured, or retreated east. The Reichsbahn's capacity to repair the German railway network inside Germany was intact, but the network in the occupied West had been abandoned to whatever condition the bombing had left it in. When Germany attempted to prepare the Ardennes offensive in October and November 1944, assembling the forces, fuel, and ammunition for the largest German counterattack on the Western Front, it did so against a background of railway capacity that had been permanently reduced by the transportation plan's effects. The assembly went slowly. It went more slowly than Hitler's planners had projected. The fuel that was supposed to be stockpiled for the offensive arrived in quantities that were consistently below requirement. The ammunition that was supposed to fill the forward dumps arrived late and in reduced loads. The Panzer divisions that were supposed to be at full strength by December 1st were still receiving their equipment in the second week of December. The offensive launched on December 16th with less fuel, less ammunition, and less time for preparation than the plan had assumed. General Fritz Kramer, Chief of Staff of the 6th Panzer Army, documented this in his post-war interrogation, a document that sits in the Foreign Military Studies Archive alongside the assessments of Rundstedt and Model and Manteuffel. Kramer described the fuel situation at the start of the offensive as insufficient for the operation as planned. The calculation that Colonel General Dietrich had made, that the offensive could not reach Antwerp, was partly a calculation about terrain and daylight and road conditions. It was also a calculation about fuel. The fuel that was not in the forward dumps on December 16th was not there because the trains that should have brought it had been running on a network that the transportation plan had degraded beyond the Reichsbahn's capacity to fully restore. The 2,199 tanks of autumn 1944 were the headline number. The fuel that did not reach the Ardennes was the number that ended the offensive. Kampfgruppe Peiper ran out of fuel on December 23, 1944, near the village of Gleize in eastern Belgium. Peiper's column had been the spearhead of the entire Ardennes offensive. The formation that was supposed to drive fastest and furthest reached the Meuse River and opened the road to Antwerp. It had started with approximately 800 vehicles and had moved faster in the first days than any other German formation, capturing an American fuel depot at Bullingen that gave it enough gasoline to continue for another day. One day. The depot at Bullingen contained roughly 50,000 gallons of American fuel, enough for a single day of heavy armored movement. Peiper used it and kept moving. When it ran out, there was no resupply. The trains that should have been pushing fuel forward to replenish what the offensive was consuming were not running. The road network behind Peiper was under continuous Allied air attack. The fuel that the offensive's planners had calculated would be available at forward dumps was not there. Peiper's men blew the breech blocks on their tanks, abandoned their vehicles, and walked east through the snow. The fuel arithmetic of the Ardennes offensive is documented in the post-war interrogations with a specificity that makes it possible to trace the precise mechanism of failure. The offensive required approximately 4 million gallons of fuel to reach the Meuse River. German planners had stockpiled approximately 2 million gallons in forward positions before the attack began, half the requirement, on the assumption that captured American fuel depots would supply the difference. The assumption was not irrational. American fuel depots existed. Bulge proved they could be captured. What the assumption did not account for was that an offensive moving through the Ardennes in December, on narrow roads, through forest, in snow, could not move fast enough to capture fuel depots faster than it was consuming fuel. The consumption rate exceeded the capture rate. The gap between what was available and what was needed widened with every kilometer of advance. Behind the gap was the transportation plan. The fuel that should have been in the forward dumps, that would have been in the forward dumps if the railway network had been functioning at its 1943 capacity, had not arrived because the network was not functioning at its 1943 capacity. The Reichsbahn had been repairing the damage from the spring and summer bombing campaign since September, but the repairs were incomplete, and the capacity restored was a fraction of what had existed before April 1944. A functioning railway network would not have made the Ardennes offensive strategically sound. Rundstedt was right that the plan was impossible. Model was right that the small solution was the only realistic option. Manteuffel was right that the fuel was insufficient before the first shot was fired. But a functioning railway network might have put enough fuel in the forward dumps to get Peiper to the Meuse. Peiper at the Meuse was not Antwerp. It was not a strategic victory. But it was a river line that the Allies would have had to defend, and defending it would have required forces that were otherwise available for the offensive operations that ended the war in the spring of 1945. The transportation plan had not made the Ardennes offensive impossible. Geography and the Allied army had done that. What the transportation plan had done was ensure that the offensive operated at the margin of its fuel requirement rather than within it, that every calculation Peiper's staff made about how far they could go was a calculation about hours rather than days. Hours was not enough. Spaatz had argued for the oil plan over the transportation plan in the spring debates of 1944. He was not wrong. Destroying Germany's synthetic fuel production was eventually the decisive strategic bombing campaign of the war, and it began in May 1944. But the oil campaign worked over months and years. The transportation plan worked in weeks. The divisions that arrived in Normandy 2 weeks late instead of 3 days late, Das Reich and Leibstandart and Hitlerjugend, arrived too late because of the transportation plan's destruction of the French network. The fuel that did not reach Gleize in December 1944 did not arrive because of the transportation plan's continuing degradation of the Western German network. The same decision, the same bombing campaign, 2 consequences, 6 months apart, on opposite sides of the same front. Both pointed in the same direction. The post-war debate about the transportation plan has never fully resolved. It began before the war ended, in the autumn of 1944, when the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, a team of economists, engineers, and military analysts dispatched to Europe to assess the results of the Allied bombing campaign, began interviewing German officials and examining the records of the Reich's industrial and logistical systems. The survey's findings, published in 1945 and 1946, produced a picture that was more complicated than either the transportation plan's advocates or its critics had anticipated. The oil campaign had been decisive. Speer confirmed this explicitly. The destruction of Germany's synthetic fuel production beginning in May 1944 had produced a fuel crisis that affected every branch of the German military. The Luftwaffe could not train pilots. The Panzers could not conduct mobile operations. The surface navy could not sortie. On the question of which bombing campaign had done the most strategic damage to Germany's war-making capacity, the survey's economists gave the answer that Spaatz had been arguing for since March 1944. The oil campaign won. But the survey's finding on the transportation plan was more nuanced than a simple ranking of campaigns. The economists found that the destruction of the German railway network in France and Belgium had not, in isolation, been decisive. German forces had continued to fight. The supply reductions had been severe, but not total. A defensive army in a fixed position could operate on significantly less supply than an advancing army, and the Wehrmacht in Normandy was primarily defending. What the survey found was something different, a compound effect. The transportation plan had not stopped the German army, it had degraded it. And degraded is a specific military condition that is different from stopped. A stopped army cannot fight. A degraded army fights at reduced effectiveness, with less fuel for maneuver, less ammunition for artillery, less capacity to reinforce failures or exploit successes. The difference between a German counterattack at full strength in June 1944 and a German counterattack at 60% supply is not visible in the daily battle reports. It is visible in the outcomes, in the attacks that failed to achieve their objectives, in the positions that were abandoned because there was no fuel to hold them, in the reserves that arrived too late because the trains had not run on schedule. Zuckerman's original analysis had predicted this with a precision that the survey's economists acknowledged. He had not claimed that bombing railways would stop the German army. He had claimed that it would reduce German operational flexibility below the threshold required to respond effectively to a major Allied offensive. The threshold he had identified, the supply level at which a German armored division could conduct mobile operations rather than static defense, had been correctly calculated. Below that threshold, Das Reich took 17 days instead of 3. Below that threshold, the 21st Panzer Division's D-Day counterattack stopped for lack of fuel. Below that threshold, Peiper walked back from Gleize through the snow. The survey's economists were measuring the campaign against an ambitious standard: complete interdiction of German supply, forcing withdrawal from defensive positions. By that standard, the transportation plan had failed. By the standard Zuckerman had actually set, reducing German operational flexibility below the threshold required for an effective response to Overlord, it had succeeded. The distinction between those two standards was the source of the post-war debate, and the debate persisted because both sides were measuring the right thing on the wrong scale. Harris measured the transportation plan against what area bombing of German cities was supposed to achieve: the complete collapse of German will and capacity. By that standard, everything short of total victory was failure. Spaatz measured it against what the oil campaign was achieving: the progressive destruction of Germany's ability to fuel its military. By that standard, the transportation plan was a tactical diversion from the strategic campaign. Eisenhower had measured it against a specific, limited objective. He had said he would judge the plan worthwhile if it delayed even one division. It delayed dozens. Solly Zuckerman lived until 1993. He spent the post-war decades as one of Britain's most influential scientific advisors, chief scientific advisor to the Ministry of Defense, president of the Zoological Society of London, author of memoirs that described his wartime work with the detached precision of a man who had watched his conclusions validated by history and still found the validation insufficient evidence for certainty. He was knighted in 1956. He became Baron Zuckerman of Burnham Thorpe in 1971. He never stopped arguing about railways. In his memoirs, and in the academic literature that accumulated around the strategic bombing debate, Zuckerman continued to make the case he had made in 1944, that the transportation plan had been the correct priority, that its effects on the Normandy campaign had been decisive within the limits he had claimed for it, and that the post-war debate had consistently measured his campaign against standards he had never set. His opponents, the advocates of the oil campaign, the historians who credited Spaatz's targeting decisions with the decisive strategic impact, were not wrong about the oil campaign's importance. They were measuring a different thing. The oil campaign's effects were felt over months. The transportation plan's effects were felt in weeks. For an operation that depended on the first weeks going correctly, on the beachhead surviving long enough to become a lodgment, on the lodgment surviving long enough to become an army group, weeks mattered more than months. The specific number that ends the argument is not 2,199 tanks. It is 72 hours versus 17 days. Das Reich should have reached Normandy in 3 days. It arrived in 17. The 14 days of difference were the transportation plan's contribution to the Normandy campaign. expressed in the specific currency of operational time. 14 days during which the Allied beachhead grew from a fragile strip of sand to an established front. 14 days during which 800,000 men and 150,000 vehicles crossed the channel and made the lodgment permanent. 14 days that the German armored reserve spent on French roads instead of at the German front line. Eisenhower understood this arithmetic before the invasion began. He had overruled Harris and Spaatz and ignored Churchill's appeal to Roosevelt because he understood that the Normandy campaign would be decided not by what Germany could produce, but by how fast Germany could respond. Speed of response was a railway problem, and a railway problem had a railway solution. The bomber generals who resisted the transportation plan were not wrong about their own campaigns. Harris was right that area bombing degraded German industrial production and civilian morale. Spaatz was right that the oil campaign was strategically decisive over the long term. Both campaigns contributed to Germany's defeat. But in the spring of 1944, with D-Day 6 weeks away, and the question of the invasion's survival hanging on whether German armor could reach the beachhead before the Allies consolidated it, neither area bombing nor oil campaign produced results in the time frame that mattered. The transportation plan produced results in weeks. A zoologist from Oxford, working from bomb damage assessments in Sicily, had understood something about railways that the professional airmen had not. A railway network was not a collection of targets. It was a system. And a system attacked simultaneously at hundreds of interdependent points degraded faster than any of its individual components could be repaired. The tanks that sat on rail flat cars east of the Rhine in the autumn of 1944 were not sitting there because Allied bombers had destroyed the factories that built them. The factories were working. The tanks existed. They were sitting there because the trains that should have carried them west were waiting for bridges that Allied bombers had dropped into French rivers in April and May, repaired partially by Reichsbahn crews working under air attack, and dropped again before the repair was complete. The tanks proved the argument by not moving. Zuckerman had said railways. Eisenhower had listened. The tanks did not arrive. That is the entire story.